Some jobs pay you for your time. These ones took something else entirely. For the purpose of this story, I'll go by Marcus. I was 23 and working as a property inspector for a regional insurance company based out of Reno. The job was simple. Drive to a property, take photos, fill out a condition report, and move on. Most of the time, it was suburban homes or small commercial buildings. Easy stuff, but every once in a while, they'd send me out to some rural address that barely showed up on GPS, and those were the ones I dreaded.
Come on.
This was mid-June, and I'd been assigned a batch of properties in Lander County, which is about as empty as Nevada gets. We're talking stretches of highway where you won't see another car for 45 minutes. The properties were mostly old ranches and mining-adjacent parcels that the company insured decades ago and never bothered to reinspect. No, some point my supervisor told me some of them might not even have structures on them anymore. He said if the building was gone, just photograph the lot and note it. The first 3 were fine. 2 had houses on them. 1 was just a concrete slab with some rusted fencing. Standard. The 4th address was the one that changed things. The GPS brought me down a gravel road about 11 miles off the highway. The road wasn't maintained. I could tell because the gravel had mostly been swallowed by dirt and scrub, and there were sections where I had to slow my truck to a crawl to avoid bottoming out. There was no cell service. I'd lost it about 6 miles back, which wasn't unusual for that part of the state, but it always made me a little more alert. The property was a single-story ranch house, sitting on what looked like 40 or 50 acres of flat, dry nothing. There was a detached garage to the left and some kind of small outbuilding further back. The house itself looked like it had been vacant for a while. The windows were intact but filthy, and the front door had a padlock on it that was so rusted it had fused to the hasp. There was no car, no tire tracks, no indication anyone had been out there recently. I started with the exterior, walking the perimeter and snapping photos. The siding was weathered, but structurally sound. The roof had some damage on the north side. I noted everything on my tablet and moved to the garage. The garage door was stuck, so I went around to the side entrance. It was unlocked. Inside was mostly empty. Some old shelving, a few paint cans, a workbench with nothing on it. I took my photos and moved on. The outbuilding was where things started feeling wrong. It was maybe 200 square feet. Built from cinder block with a flat metal roof. There was one door and no windows. The door was metal, heavier than it needed to be for a building that size. It was also unlocked, which I found odd given that the main house was padlocked. I pulled it open, and the first thing that hit me was the temperature. It was at least 15 degrees cooler inside, which made no sense. There was no insulation visible, no ventilation system, nothing that would explain why a cinder block box in the Nevada desert would feel like a walk-in cooler. The interior was bare. Concrete floor, bare walls, a single overhead light fixture with no bulb. But the floor had marks on it. Not scratches or stains. Marks. Dozens of small, deliberate tally marks scratched into the concrete near the base of the far wall. They were grouped in sets of 5, the way you'd count days. I crouched down, and started counting. I stopped at 140 because the marks continued around the corner and I didn't want to keep going. I stood up and took a photo. The flash lit up the room, and that's when I noticed something else. There were 2 small holes drilled into the wall at about waist height. They were clean, precise, maybe half an inch in diameter. I leaned down and looked through one of them. It went all the way through the cinder block and opened to the outside. I could see daylight through it. The other hole was the same. I didn't know what to make of any of it. I told myself it was probably an old storage building, and the marks were from some bored ranch hand. The holes could have been for running cable or hose. There were explanations, but the temperature still bothered me. And the door. That door was heavy enough to hold something in. I finished my notes and walked back toward my truck. As I was loading my tablet into the passenger seat, I glanced back at the outbuilding one more time. The door was closed.
No.
I had left it open. I was certain of that because I specifically propped it with my boot while I took the interior photos, and I remembered stepping out and leaving it wide open behind me. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, staring at that closed door. The wind was dead. There was no breeze at all. I could feel the sun pressing down on the back of my neck, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse. I got in my truck and left. I didn't close the tailgate. I didn't adjust my mirrors. I just reversed down that gravel road until I could turn around, and then I drove. When I got back to the office 2 days later, I submitted my reports. I didn't mention the tally marks or the door. I just noted the outbuilding as a detached storage structure in fair condition. But I did something I'd never done before. I pulled the property's history from our system. The parcel had been insured since 1987. The policyholder was listed as a trust, not a person. There was no contact number. The last inspection on file was from 2004, and the notes from that inspector were almost entirely redacted. The only legible line read, "Recommend cancellation of policy. Do not reassign." I asked my supervisor about it. He said he didn't know anything and told me not to worry about it. But the way he said it, without looking up from his screen, felt rehearsed, like he'd been asked before. I never went back to that property. I left the company about 4 months later for unrelated reason. But I still think about that outbuilding. I think about the tally marks and the temperature and that door closing on its own. And I think about whoever scratched 140 plus days into a concrete floor inside a windowless room in the middle of the Nevada desert. I don't think they were counting out of boredom. I'm 27 now, but this happened the summer I turned 19. I was working at a marina on Lake Hartwell, right on the Georgia-South Carolina border. It was a seasonal gig. I pumped gas into boats, helped with dock maintenance, and occasionally drove the courtesy shuttle for guests staying at the cabins up the hill. The marina was small, family-owned, and during the week it was practically dead. Weekends were busy, but Monday through Thursday, it was just me and a guy named Dale, who managed the place. Dale was in his late 50s. Quiet guy. He'd been running the marina for over 20 years and knew the lake better than anyone. He had this habit of checking the weather radar on his phone every hour, even on clear days. I asked him about it once, and he just said, "Lake changes faster than the sky does." I didn't really know what that meant at the time. The marina had a small office near the fuel dock, and behind it was a storage building where we kept life jackets, rope, tools, and a few old kayaks that guests could borrow. There was also a bait cooler out front that Dale restocked every morning. My shift usually started at 7 a.m. and ended around 5, but during the slow weeks, Dale would sometimes let me leave early. If there was nothing going on. One Wednesday in late July, I showed up to find Dale's truck in the lot, but the office locked. That was unusual. Dale was always inside by 6:30, coffee already made, radio already on. I knocked on the office door and got no answer. I walked around to the storage building. Locked. I checked the fuel dock. His clipboard was sitting on the pump console. which meant he'd started his morning checklist but hadn't finished it. I called his cell. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. I figured maybe he'd walked up to the cabins for something, so I sat on the dock and waited. About 20 minutes later, he came walking down the hill from the tree line, not from the cabin path,
Where'd he come
but from the woods to the east of it. He was moving slowly, and when he got closer, I could see his boots were caked in red mud up to the ankle. His face looked pale, which was hard to do when you spent every day in the sun. I asked him if he was okay. He looked at me like he'd forgotten I worked there. Then he blinked a few times and said, "Yeah, thought I heard something up in the woods." Went to check. I asked what he heard. He didn't answer. He just walked past me into the office and started the coffee maker. The rest of that day was normal, or close to it. Dale was quieter than usual, but he wasn't a talkative guy to begin with, so I didn't push it. We had 2 boats come in for fuel, and 1 family rented a kayak, standard Wednesday. But that night, around 9 p.m., I got a call from Dale. He never called me after hours. He asked if I could come in early the next morning, like 5:30 instead of 7. He said he needed help moving some equipment before the weekend rush. I said sure. He thanked me and hung up. The call lasted maybe 30 seconds, but something about his voice was off. It was flat, not tired, not stressed, just flat, like he was reading from a card. I showed up at 5:30 the next morning. The sun wasn't fully up yet, and the lake was that dark silver color it gets before dawn. Dale's truck was there again, but this time the office was open and the lights were on. I walked in and found him sitting at his desk with his back to the door. He didn't turn around when I came in. I said good morning, and he just nodded. On his desk, spread out in front of him, was a topographic map of the lake and the surrounding area. It was old, creased, and had been written on with red marker. There were circles drawn on it, maybe 8 or 9 of them, scattered around the eastern shore. I asked him what the map was for. He folded it up immediately, almost too fast, and shoved it into his desk drawer. He said it was nothing, just some old survey stuff. We spent the next hour moving dock bumpers and restacking life jackets. Normal work. But twice during that hour, Dale stopped what he was doing and looked toward the tree line to the east. Both times, I looked too. I didn't see anything. The second time, I asked him what he was looking at. He said, "Just checking the weather." There wasn't a cloud in the sky. That Friday, the marina got busy. A group of college kids rented a pontoon boat for the day, and a few regulars came in for fuel. I was running around all morning. Around noon, one of the regulars, a guy named Hank who kept his base boat at the marina year-round, pulled me aside. He asked me if Dale had been acting strange. I told him I wasn't sure. Hank said he'd been out fishing early that morning on the eastern arm of the lake, near a cove that most people avoided because the water was too shallow for anything bigger than a kayak. He said he saw Dale's aluminum skiff tied up to a fallen tree near the bank. He said Dale was standing on the shore, not fishing, not doing anything, just standing at the edge of the tree line, facing the woods. Hank said he called out to him from maybe 60 yards away. Dale didn't respond. Hank said he called out again, louder. Dale turned around, looked at him, and then turned back toward the woods without saying a word. Hank told me it gave him a bad feeling, so he left. I didn't know what to do with that information. Dale was my boss. He was also the only person I really interacted with at that job. I didn't want to overstep, but I was starting to get genuinely concerned. The following Monday, I came in at 7 like normal. Dale wasn't there. His truck wasn't in the lot. The office was locked. I waited until 8, then 9. I called him 6 times. No answer. I called the marina's owner, a woman named Patty, who lived in Greenville. She said she'd try to reach him and told me to just hold down the fort. Dale didn't show up that day, or the next. Patty drove down on Wednesday, and we filed a missing person report. The police found his truck parked at a boat ramp about 4 miles south of the marina. His skiff was gone. They searched the eastern arm of the lake for 3 days. On the second day, they found the skiff. It was beached in that same shallow cove Hank had mentioned, tied to the same fallen tree. The engine was off. The key was still in the ignition. Dale's phone was sitting on the bench seat, dead. They searched the surrounding woods for another week. Dogs, drones, volunteers. They found his boot prints leading from the shore into the tree line. The prints went about a quarter mile in and then just stopped. Not like he turned around, not like the ground changed. The prints just ended in the middle of a clearing, as if he'd been lifted straight off the earth. Dale was never found. The marina closed at the end of that summer. Patty sold the property the following year. I drove past it once, maybe 2 years ago. The dock is gone. The office is boarded up. The storage building is still there, though, and the tree line to the east looks exactly the same. Dense, dark, and close. Closer than I remember it being. I don't go near that lake anymore. Not because I think something's going to happen to me, but because I keep thinking about that map Dale had on his desk. Those red circles. I only saw it for a few seconds before he folded it up, but I'm almost positive one of those circles was drawn around the exact cove where they found his boat. And I can't stop wondering how many of the other circles had names attached to them too. I'll call myself Tara for this. I was 30, and had just signed a lease on a duplex in a small town about 40 minutes outside of Tulsa. I'd moved there for a nursing position at a regional hospital, and the duplex was the only rental I could find on short notice that wasn't falling apart. It was a simple layout. 2 units side by side, each with a front door, a small living area, 1 bedroom, a kitchen, and a bathroom. My unit was on the right. The left unit was occupied by a woman I'll call Diane. Diane looked to be in her mid-60s. She was thin, had short gray hair, and wore the same style of loose floral blouse almost every time I saw her. She introduced herself the day I moved in. She came over with a small plate of cookies wrapped in cellophane and told me she was glad to have a neighbor again. She said the last tenant had moved out months ago and she'd been alone in the building since. She was polite, soft-spoken, and smiled a lot. I liked her immediately. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. Diane and I would wave to each other in the mornings. She'd sometimes knock on my door in the evening to ask if I needed anything from the store. She told me she was retired and that her husband had passed a few years back. She didn't have kids. She spent most of her time gardening in the small patch of yard behind the building and watching television. I could hear her TV through the wall sometimes, always tuned to what sounded like old game shows. The first thing that struck me as odd was the knocking. It started about a month after I moved in. I'd be lying in bed around 11 at night, almost asleep, and I'd hear 3 soft knocks on the shared wall between our bedrooms. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 evenly spaced taps, like someone gently rapping their knuckles on wood. The first time it happened, I assumed Diane had bumped into something. The second time, a few nights later, I figured maybe she was hanging a picture or adjusting furniture. By the 4th or 5th time, I started paying closer attention. The knocks always came in 3s, always at the same time, right around 11 p.m., always on the shared wall. Same rhythm. And they always stopped after the 3rd knock. No follow-up. No additional sounds. Just 3 taps and then silence. I mentioned it to Diane casually one morning. I said something like, "Hey, I keep hearing a little tapping on the wall at night. Just wanted to make sure everything's okay on your side." She looked at me with this completely blank expression for about 2 seconds. And then she smiled and said,
the pipes.
"Oh, that's probably the pipes. This building is so old." I nodded and dropped it. It was a reasonable explanation. Old buildings make noise. I'd lived in enough of them to know that. But the knocking didn't stop. If anything, it became more consistent. It went from every few nights to every single night. 3 knocks. 11 p.m. Same wall. Same rhythm. I started setting a timer on my phone just to see if I was imagining the consistency. I wasn't. Over the course of 2 weeks, the knocks came within the same 3-minute window every single night. Pipes don't do that. I brought it up to Diane again, this time more directly. I told her I'd been tracking it, and that it was happening every night at the same time. I asked her if she was awake at that hour, and if she could hear it from her side. Her reaction was different this time. She didn't smile. She just looked at me and said, "I go to bed at 9. I don't hear anything." Then she changed the subject. That response bothered me more than the knocking itself. Not because it was rude, but because it felt practiced. Like she'd already decided what she was going to say before I even asked. A few nights later, I decided to do something I probably should have done sooner. At 10:45, I turned off all the lights in my bedroom and sat on the floor with my back against the shared wall. I wanted to listen as closely as possible. I wanted to hear if there was any movement on the other side before the knocks came. At 10:58, I heard Diane's TV turn off. I heard her footsteps move through her living room and into her bedroom. I heard her bed creak as she got in. Then, silence. Complete silence for about 2 minutes. And then, at exactly 11:01, I heard her get back out of bed. The footsteps were slow and deliberate. They moved from her bed to the shared wall, and then she stopped. I could feel her presence on the other side. I don't know how to explain that, but I could feel it. The wall between us was maybe 6 inches thick, and I knew she was standing right there, inches from my head. I held my breath. Three knocks. Slow, deliberate. Each one placed with care, like she was pressing her knuckles into the wall rather than tapping it. The sound was so close that I could feel the vibration in my spine. Then she walked back to her bed. The mattress creaked, and that was it. I sat there on the floor for a long time after that. My hands were shaking. I wasn't scared in the way you'd be scared of a loud noise or a sudden threat. I was scared in a deeper way. The kind of fear that comes from realizing someone you trusted has been doing something inexplicable right next to you. Every single night. For weeks. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my landlord. He was an older guy who owned a few properties in town. I told him about the knocking and asked if Diane had any history of unusual behavior. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that made my stomach drop. He said, "Diane's a good tenant. She's been there for 11 years. But you're the 4th person to live in that unit since I've owned the building. The other 3 all asked me the same question." I asked him what happened to them. He said they all moved out. None of them gave a specific reason. They just left. I lasted 2 more weeks. During those 2 weeks, the knocking continued every night without fail. But something else started happening. I began finding small objects on my doorstep in the mornings. A smooth river stone. A single birthday candle, unused. A small square of fabric cut from what looked like a man's dress shirt. A brass button. Each item was placed precisely in the center of my welcome mat, as if measured. Never saw Diane place them. I checked my doorstep every night before bed and every morning when I woke up. The items appeared sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. I installed a cheap security camera pointed at my front door. The first night I had it running, the camera recorded 8 hours of nothing. No movement, no Diane, no anyone. But when I opened my door that morning, there was a small glass marble sitting on the mat. I reviewed the footage 3 times. At no point did anyone approach my door.
There's nothing.
The marble simply was not there at 11:47 p.m. when I last checked the feed, and then it was there at 5:52 a.m. when I opened the door. The camera never triggered. The motion sensor never activated. There was no gap in the recording. I moved out the following Saturday. I didn't tell Diane I was leaving. I packed my car while she was out, and I drove to a motel near the hospital. I broke my lease and paid the penalty. I didn't care. About 6 months later, I ran into my old landlord at a gas station. He recognized me, and we talked for a minute. I asked him if anyone had moved into my old unit. He said yes. A young guy, early 20s, had been there for about 3 months. I asked how it was going. The landlord paused, then said, "He asked me about the knocking last week." I didn't say anything. I just nodded and got in my car. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before I could drive. Because the thing that still gets to me, the thing I can never fully shake, is that Diane knew I was listening that night. I'm sure of it. She got out of bed, walked to the wall, and knocked anyway. She didn't care that I knew. And somehow, that's worse than if she'd been trying to hide it. Whatever she was doing, she wanted me to hear it. She wanted me to sit there on the other side of that wall and know that she was right there. 3 knocks every night, and she was never going to stop.